Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will about the fourth module of the Section 1 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Patient Records and Data Handling. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidates' portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the 4RD module. These are the learning outcomes candidates should be able to meet when they have completed this module. They should be able to maintain confidentiality and comply with data governance requirements. They should be able to manage and keep clear, accurate, and detailed records in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols and guidelines. And they be able to adhere to specimen identification protocols, use systems for the accurate and correct identification of lab specimens and recognize the importance of backup storage of electronic data. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. And the task is, review a specific sample pathway, from receipt to result, explaining the importance of consent and confidentiality. Let's break this down. The first part is asking the candidate to review a specific sample pathway. What this means is, that the candidate chooses an appropriate sample, and they follow its path through the lab. The second part of the task is asking the candidate to start the path at the specimen reception and follow it all the way through to the result. This is very specific, which is helpful, so the candidate could pick a sample when they are booking in, and then follow it through, until it reaches the stage, which in histology department will be pathologist's report. Different disciplines might have different pathways, so keep that in mind. The last part of the task is asking the candidate to explain the importance of consent and confidentiality. Candidates should find out what the consent is and why is it important. For this reason, I would also recommend that they choose a sample that comes in with the consent, if possible. In histopathology, we receive POC samples since that would be a great example for this evidence. Some departments also receive PM cases with consent forms, so that might be an option as well. Candidate could annotate the consent and include it in their evidence. They also need to highlight the importance of consent and confidentiality. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. Candidate is asked to relate this evidence to the lab they are working in. They should choose a sample received in their lab. Next part of advice is asking them to clearly describe the sample pathway. They should think about what exactly is happening to the sample as it goes through the different sections in the lab. They should show their understanding of different sections of the lab, and what is happening to the sample in each of them. For histology it would be dissection, processing, embedding, microtomy, staining, digital scanning, block checking and booking out to pathologist for reporting. The next advice is letting the candidate know about different forms they could use to present this piece of evidence. It could be a written piece, or a diagram, or a flowchart, or images, or a video, or an animation. Candidates should choose a form they will be happy to do. They can make it very personalized, which I really love. They should make it their own. The next part is asking them about the consent, specifically how and when it is given. To meet this, candidate will have to find out how patients consent to procedures when they have theirs taken. In histopathology, if they choose the POC sample, the sample is accompanied by a request form and the consent form, that is filled and signed by the patient. The consent form has a lot of very important information they can use in their evidence. You could advise them to read the consent form carefully and understand it. They could then bring this knowledge into this piece of evidence. Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, adhere to the professional duty of confidentiality and understand when disclosure may be required. Candidate needs to adhere to duty of confidentiality and understand need for disclosure. Does the candidate adhere to the confidentiality policies? Do they understand why they need to act confidentially? Do they understand the need for disclosure? Do they know when to disclose information and when not to? Candidate could consider explaining confidentiality. What is their duty when it comes to confidentiality, and how do they decide when to disclose sensitive information? Situations that require disclosure of information, secure information, obtaining consent, limit disclosure, record keeping, professional scope and duty, legal requirement and exception, public safety and reasons when disclosure would be required, consequences of non-compliance like disciplinary action, struck from register. Part of the mandatory training in many trusts is the subject of confidentiality. They could have a look at it and see if they can use some information from there as well. The second standard is, understand the principles of information and data governance and be aware of the safe and effective use of health, social care and other relevant information. Candidate needs to understand the information governance. Does the candidate follow regulations for data governance? Do they know the principles of information governance? Do they use information safely and effectively? Candidate could consider data management and its legal, ethical importance, accountability, transparency, compliance with laws and regulations like GDPR or Data Protection Act, Freedom of Information Act 2000, Caldecott principles, integrity and quality measures, availability, accessibility, retention, disposal, purpose limitations. They could bring in some specific examples from their practice. The third standard is, recognize that the concepts of confidentiality and informed consent extend to all mediums, including illustrative clinical records such as photography, video and audio recordings and digital platforms. Candidate needs to recognize that confidentiality applies to all communication media. Does the candidate understand the concept of confidentiality? Do they comply with relevant policies? Do they apply confidentiality to various media? Candidate could consider the concept of confidentiality, the principles of information and data governance, various media used in your lab, obtaining explicit consent, storing digital data secure, duty of confidentiality, explaining use to patients, protected accessibility to media, compliant with laws and regulations, importance of anonymization, use and adherence to policies. The fourth standard is, use digital record-keeping tools, where required. Candidate needs to use digital record-keeping tools. Does the candidate use digital record-keeping tools? Do they use them appropriately? Can they use various digital tools? Do they follow relevant policies when using such tools? Candidate could consider LIMS systems, tracking systems like Vantage, imaging software, electronic copies of documents, Pulse, patient information portals like Spine or ICE, digital dictations, digital pathology, and so on. Those are the standards candidate has to keep in mind when writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 10 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards candidate has to meet by 2 pieces of choice evidence. The first standard is, adhere to the professional duty of confidentiality and understand when disclosure may be required. This standard is the same as the first standard in the mandatory evidence. So if the candidate met this standard in the mandatory evidence, it is not needed to be covered in the choice evidence. One standard less for them to worry about. The second standard is, recognize and respond in a timely manner to situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users, carers, and/or the wider public. Candidate needs to be able to appropriately share information to safeguard service users or public. Does the candidate know how to recognize situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users? Can they give examples of situations that require information disclosure? Is the candidate able to respond in timely manner to those situations? Candidate could consider situations when there is a clear risk of harm to service users, or when it is required by the law or court order. Key situations might be risk of harm, crime, public interest, statutory duty, incapacitated service user, patterns of abuse, risk posed by other professionals, coercion, during life-threatening emergencies, during child transitions in care, when there is a risk of neglect. Timeframe, being proactive, not waiting to be asked if abuse is suspected, being transparent, and the 7 golden rules, which are: understand data protection, seek consent, use professional judgment, sharing necessary information, seek advice. Safety overrides privacy and record decisions. Candidate can find more information in their mandatory safeguarding training. The third standard is, understand the need to ensure confidentiality is maintained in all situations in which service users rely on additional communication support such as interpreters or translators. Candidate needs to ensure confidentiality in all situations. Can the candidate ensure confidentiality in all situations? Do they ensure confidentiality when additional communication support is used? Do they know what additional communication support is available and how to make it confidential? Candidate could consider professional standards, code of ethics, use of qualified personnel like interpreters that are bound by the confidentiality agreements and legal requirements, and have appropriate training to handle sensitive information, creation of safe environment where service user can speak freely without fear. Consider clear protocols for qualified personnel like interpreters that state confidentiality agreements, legal requirements, and framework like GDPR. Consider accuracy and safety when using untrained interpreters like family members and friends. The fourth standard is, recognize that the concepts of confidentiality and informed consent extend to all mediums, including illustrative clinical records such as photography, video and audio recordings, and digital platforms. This standard is again same as the third standard in the mandatory evidence. So if the candidate met the standard in the mandatory evidence, it is not needed to be covered in the choice evidence. Another standard less for them to worry about. The fifth standard is, keep full, clear and accurate records in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols, and guidelines. Candidate needs to be able to keep records in accordance to relevant legislations and guidelines. Does the candidate keep full, clear, and accurate records? Do they follow relevant guideline regulations? Do they know the importance of keeping accurate records? Do they know the guidelines and regulations that govern record keeping? Candidate could consider relevant legislations, protocols, and guidelines, GDPR, Data Protection Act, Freedom to Information Act, Public Record Act, professional standards, guidelines, reasons why the records need to be full, clear, and accurate, to ensure safe, effective, and continuous care, safeguarding and accountability, principles like recording relevant information promptly, legibly, accuracy and security, accessibility, confidentiality, completeness, legibility, and clarity. They could have a look at their information governance mandatory training that most trusts have in place. The sixth standard is manage records and all other information in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols, and guidelines. Candidate needs to be able to manage records in accordance with relevant legislations and guidelines. Can the candidate manage records properly? Do they follow relevant legislations and guidelines? Do they know what legislations to follow? Do they know why they need to manage records appropriately? Candidate could consider legislations, protocols, and guidelines like GDPR, Data Protection Act, Freedom to Information Act, Public Record Act, Health and Social Care Act, local trust policies, key aspects of managed records like data quality, security, confidentiality, retention, disposal, and best practice, information management like creation, use, maintenance, review, retention, archival, disposal or destruction of information. The seventh standard is, recognize, communicate and understand the risks and possible serious consequences of errors and omissions in both requests for, and results of, lab investigations. Candidate needs to recognize the risks and consequences of errors during lab investigations. Does the candidate know the risks of lab investigations? Do they know the consequences of errors? Do they know types of errors that can occur? Can the candidate apply measures to reduce errors? Candidate could consider various errors during lab investigations like placing a tissue in the wrong cassette, or a section on a wrong slide, pre-analytical, analytical and post-analytical risks errors, consequences to the patient like change in diagnosis, wrong treatment, patient harm, misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, mortality, litigation or distress, prevention like PID checks, electronic tagging of samples, communication, audits, ISO 15189, training, awareness, QMS and SOPs. The eighth standard is, use systems for the accurate and correct identification of service users and lab specimens. Candidate needs to use systems to correctly identify service users and samples. Can the candidate use various systems? Do they use them correctly? Candidate could consider patient ID checks when booking in samples, patient demographics on the request form, LIMS system, types of samples received, sample labeling, barcoding or electronic tagging, sample traceability throughout the lab via tracking systems like Vantage, SOPs, training, sample acceptance policy and so on. The ninth standard is understand the need to adhere to protocols of specimen identification, including barcoding and electronic tag systems. Candidate needs to adhere to protocols for specimen identification. Does the candidate follow SOPs when identifying specimens? Do they barcode samples correctly? Do they follow the methodology properly? Do they know the consequences of not following the protocols? Do they understand why it is important to follow protocols? Candidate could consider the reasons for adhering to protocols of specimen identification like regulatory requirement, patient safety, diagnostic accuracy, timely treatment, misdiagnosis, streamlining workflow or cost reduction, consequences of not adhering to those protocols like patient harm, misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, mortality, litigation or distress to patients. The 10th standard is understand the importance of backup storage of electronic data. Candidate needs to understand the importance of data backup. Does the candidate understand the importance of data backup? Do they know the consequences of not backing up data? Do they know what backup system is used in your lab? Candidate could consider important protection of data, defense against ransomware, enables business continuity, legal requirement, in case of a human error via accidental deletion, cost-effective approach, maintains data security and integrity, potential risks of not backing up data like permanent data loss, theft, accidental deletion, affected service continuity, compromised safeguarding and safety, legal implications and penalties, loss of public trust, financial and reputational damage. Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when you are creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the two pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence, and that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as your choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good, and can meet several standards, which is what you need and want. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you the training officer and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.